Now, the first topic today we have is the material culture of Bukit Brown. The Bukit Brown Municipal Chinese Cemetery opened in the early 20s, about 1921 when it was proposed, and it was opened subsequently. And it operated as a cemetery for Chinese people of all clans and lineage. So it's a little different from the clan-associated cemeteries that used to operate. And it closed in 1973. So for a period of 5 decades, it housed the remains of many Singaporean Chinese. So at this cemetery, we find that the tombs, the connections of the people there, the way and inscriptions on the headstones, the design, the kind of imagery, the images that you can see on these tombs reflected the lifestyle of that time. Okay, so and how did these people live during that 5 decades, and what do we find of this at this cemetery? And today, Dr. Lai will share with us what he has found. Dr. Lai Kien is from the Department of Architecture and assistant professor from the National University of Singapore. So apart from his research into architecture, he is also a historian of art, particularly Southeast Asian art. He has also done much research on the railway history of Malaya and Singapore, as well as the legendary Han Rambutan Orchard, which is of literary and artistic significance in Singapore. So now I will invite Dr. Lai.
Good afternoon, thanks for coming to this session. I have quite a number of slides, so I will try to be as brief as possible, but if you do have any questions, please ask them maybe after the session. Hopefully we can. Well, today really is to share some of the findings that we have gathered as part of the documentation team. My section is in charge of material culture, i.e. Other than the tomb architecture, we try to look at other things such as landscapes and sort of figure out what are the sort of different connections to them. So, as you may imagine, we don't have any drawings or sort of typologies before, so we had to start from what we have at Bukit Brown, which is really, as you can see here, a varied of different kinds of tombs, and sometimes people will just secretly bury their pets. These are tombs of pets. So what we started to rely on were publications elsewhere. This is from Taiwan. We soon realized that, of course, in the transfer of material culture and the cultures themselves, there are differences. This was a bit useful. This was a publication about the tombs of Bukit China in Malacca. But we also subsequently realized that they were also referring to the same Taiwanese book, so and there was some inaccuracy, so we had to also start on our own. So really going back through some precedents, we do have people who have been writing about ethnographic material, and specifically in our time, Kevin Tan and company, who wrote this book called Spaces of the Dead. This is half of the cover, and this was published 10 years after a conference about Bidadari Cemetery, which also created a lot of uproar when it was exhumed and works proposed. Closer to us, we have NQ, who started really inspiring us with this particular book about the persons in Taiping. What NQ, I think it's in the crowd somewhere. NQ had been dissatisfied with the history, sort of mainstream histories, and therefore started to look at inscriptions of tombs ethnographically and to review a lot of different types of history. And then, of course, his most recent book is this one, which also sort of compares different sub-ethnicities, dialect groups, culture in relation to funerary matters. So here is a revision. Sorry. Bukit Brown is here, but it's actually adjacent to several other cemeteries, topic that Mr. Mok Lion talked about. But if you look at the names, and again, this is the work of Mr. Ng Ching Hui, you can find that a lot of the cemeteries, of course this is downtown Singapore and sort of cemeteries surrounding it, you can see that there is a very particular word called Ting that's attached to it, and according to scholar Tu Nan Fa, this is a very particular form that had developed in Singapore. So this is a kind of a unique form not found in China. What we see at the bottom of the screen is Heng San Ting with its infamous 1992 fire. What Mr. Tu Nan Fa is saying is really that only part of the structure had been destroyed by the fire, and it could have been restored. But unfortunately, the government required 1 year later for its complete demolition. So this is what it used to look like. What it means by a pavilion temple, a ting, is that you have a sort of through historical practice, people would come to the cemetery. They would require a place to rest, and they also require a certain space to house the main deity, the earth deity, who is again in charge of the whole network of earth deities protecting the individual tombs. So over time, this term ting became a kind of what he says is a Nanyang manifestation of a space. So in terms of tomb architecture, in the broad sense for cemeteries, you have a particular typology. So what we're going to talk about today is really just to show you the whole range, and I think the best way is to explore the cemetery and to look at all these different aspects. Some aspects about some discussion about the elements, and for me the interest is in how they vary, what are the materials, how do they relate back to time, space, rituals, and then I'll make some sort of concluding remarks about them. So tomb elements, the most common type is the Hokkien style tomb. As you can see here, what is important is that you have anthropomorphic reading of tombs. Right? You have the headstone, which is flanked by two tomb shoulders, right? And then after that, what extends out tomb arms. Okay, so the head, the shoulders, the arm, so it extends out. So there's a front area of the cemetery, and then of course the back area. Okay? Two other important elements for construction of tombs are the shoulder termination. This is found parallel to the set of tomb headstone and the tomb shoulders. And then, of course, in the perpendicular direction, you have the arm termination, which is a kind of thing. So you can see that these are architectural elements to allow for a gradual rise from the ground. And then, of course, the headstone takes the highest part of the whole cemetery construction, and then it goes down back into the ground level. So there's a kind of different elements for different extended use. So here you see this particular one used in one of the largest tombs, Ong Sam Leong and wife's tomb, where you have the terminations together with decorations and so on and so forth. The second common type of tomb that you find at Bukit Brown is the Teochew type, and here you see this is usually there is a kind of arc-shaped chair or the armchair with the tomb shoulder is in the shape of a god, Ulu, split into two and placed on both sides. And then of course you have the tomb arms extending out. And then of course what I forgot to mention is that there will always be a guardian deity, as with the Hokkien example. Right? So you always have a earth deity together with the tomb. So with this you can summarize the kind of key differences. There is usually a ring at the back, For Teochew tombs, usually it is raised. It's a kind of raised mound. Excuse me. It's a raised mound, and it fits back very nicely into the arm. And most of the time, Hokkien tombs will have very rectilinear tomb arms compared to the more curvilinear tomb arms of the Teochew grave type. Okay? So just very briefly, you will see a lot of different elements used. Mainly, the tomb itself is a way to express Chinese geomancy, and besides the main elements, you have small little ponds, the structure that are drained and so on and so forth to structure how water passes through the tombs. So again, this is a revision. You have a set of headstone and tomb shoulders, and then plus the altar table below it. The other difference between Hokkien and Teochew tombs is that you have a rather elaborate altar table, whereas for Teochew tombs it's integrated and much closer to the ground with the headstone on its own. And then there are two main ways that this is a section of the tomb of Ong Sia Se. Sometimes you would have a crypt that's constructed just behind. This is the tombstone, the headstone, and then you have this crypt that's constructed behind of brick. But some bricks are sort of left, empty, so that there's a kind of a pressure release. Right? As you know, there's kind of decay and so on and so forth. In the tomb itself, in the Hokkien tomb, you have this termination for the omega, right? Sometimes in the form of a swirl, and sometimes with animal motifs. Then, as forms of decoration, you have different kinds of statuary. So, if you had seen the Taiwanese ones, those are sort of related back to rank and so on and so forth in the official official government roles. But in Singapore, there's a little bit of liberty. I think yesterday Hugh mentioned that only if you are if you hold some kind of office that you can actually have human figures. But you can see the different range of human figures. So it represents a kind of adaptation and sort of reuse of what the figures mean in the cemetery. The latest edition actually is a terracotta soldier. When we started looking at Bukit Brown, we didn't see it, then suddenly it disappeared. Somebody put a set in front of it. Then you have the menagerie of Bukit Brown. You have a lot of different kinds of lions. And then of course, I think Raymond spotted a tiger. Here are some elephants and what we affectionately call angry birds. And then of course, for those who do not have any official codes, they are left to use. So here you see how the tomb arms extend out. And then of course, you can see this kind of a representation of a seal. This is the tomb of Ong Chim Neo. And perhaps the seal was to represent her sort of achievements as the top girl of SCGS many years ago. The others include lanterns. This is a kind of a representation of lanterns, and also some fruits. Right? So lotuses, you have different types of lotuses, pumpkins and pomegranates and so on and so forth. So, and then of course, in relation to each tomb, you would also have a guardian deity. Sometimes if you have multiple tombs, you might have just one guardian, 3 tombs, and so on, if they are in the vicinity. They are known by different names, and the interesting aspect was that we noticed that there are also gender differentiation. Sometimes if you see Ho Tu, it might not be a male deity, it might be a female deity as well. So these are the different names. At Bukit Brown, we find that some of the tombs themselves are also, of course, on the surfaces you have photographs printed on ceramic discs. Okay, mind you, these are sort of curved surfaces, not flat surfaces. But we also have ceramic images as large as almost the size of an A4, which tells us how advanced the printing technology might have been in the past. And of course, relief panels. These are sort of usually you have different kinds of folklore, filial piety stories, and so on and so forth that are engraved onto the tombstones. But essentially, this is also a kind of a display of wealth. Only the very wealthy can afford to have these, and these would have been imported from Chenzhou, which is famous for its green stone, which I'll talk about later. This is a very interesting one because it has the Republican flag. So this thing about bringing your politics to the grave. This is one example of it. Epigraphic material. It tells the story of how Singapore eventually became a place where English education became a sort of priority. There are also a lot of Peranakan countries, I'll talk about later, who prefer to have English text of the deceased accompany the formal sort of Chinese character. So this is a Zhu Tiet, which is informal sort of Chinese characters, but this is in English. And then of course we find this particular tomb with what we think is probably Peranakan text, because the dates are Go Gui Ji Si Jit Lak Gui Zap Ji Jit. You have to read it to understand what it means. Then of course then there are words that are no longer found in the dictionary. So for example, this is the number for 30. And then of course this is a person. It's supposed to be Ming Guo, but this person is emphasizing that the Guo within the country itself, it is made up of more citizens. So they took a liberty to reinvent the word and inscribe the stone. And then of course couplets. And then of course, and I think the part about heritage is that it's increasingly difficult for a younger generation to know and to read this scripts, mainly because it's in classical script. And sometimes we find characters like this, which is really sort of Hokkien characters rather than Chinese characters. Then of course you can see this, the other aspect of landscape, which forms a very important role. Families try to negotiate in the cemetery looking for particular graves using trees and landmarks. And here is this plant called the croton. You can see this is a picture near the circle, and you can see this, it stands out, and it usually adorns different parts of the tomb. So hybrids and variations are something that we really are interested in because they combine types. They combine across types. So here, for example, you would think this is by the curvilinear aspect, this is a Teochew tomb, but then of course the ring behind is really a kind of a Hokkien, more commonly found in Hokkien tombs. Right? Teochew tombs don't have that ring. Same here. And then of course sometimes you have this, which is sort of a high altar table, which is a Hokkien feature, but there's no armchair behind, which of this, which might have identified it as a Teochew tomb. Then of course there's again a combination. You have the curvilinear forms of the Teochew tomb, but then you have tomb arms and rectilinear that extend out. Further variations like the tombs, the headstones. So the headstones can vary. This is Hanking Chen. And then of course tomb shoulders. So what we're seeing is that you can have a typical form, but then of course people start to vary it for various reasons, which I will discuss afterwards. This is the tomb shore. So what is behind a Hokkien tomb can have variations. This is a well-decorated one, but then of course it will be shaped like an elephant. This is where the elephant image comes from. And then of course there are these kinds of things which of course are slightly similar to Western tombs. Here is a very interesting one. This is Tan Bu Liat. So if you know the different parts of a Hokkien tomb, you know that this has been improvised. Again, this indicates his support for the Republican era. And then of course the tomb arms extend out in a sort of a rather contemporary way. So these become posts, almost like lanterns, and then at the back you have this rectilinear tomb shore. So people take a lot of liberty, especially in this case, to change the style. Variations of Teochew tombs. This is I like this one very much. This is really abstract, and you can see this is that's the bare minimum you can have for a Teochew tomb. But sometimes you can also vary different parts, so on and so forth. So that's the fun part of BUKIT BROWN. If you know the typical one, you can find out different things. And this is amazing. This is we know that each of the different parts of this tomb of Mr. Lee Kim Soo would have had drawn design references from a class, a typical Teochew tomb, but then it is enlarged and it is sort of really exaggerated. And we think that an architect or designer must have been engaged to design this. And if we know that this is also in the style of Art Deco, we perhaps can say that there's such a thing as a Teochew Art Deco style. Maybe we can claim that. Here are some tombs, multiple tombs, or family tombs, or people who have been brought together. So that if you have these kinds of combinations, then it requires different elements to join them together. So that's the joy of sort of tomb identification. Now we come to materials. Bricks constitute a huge part of the tomb making, and if anything, I would suggest that these should be sort of collected in some way. Already from this picture you can see the different types. Some of them are locally made, Alexandra, Jurong, but then of course you can see bricks from Kluang and Kimlan and so on and so forth. And here is the logo. Oops, sorry. Here is the logo of the Brick Workers Union. Yes, they had a union before that, and there were quite a number of brick factories. But these are images of the past. Singapore doesn't have any more brickworks anymore. So the material remains in BUKIT BROWN. The other material that is commonly used is plaster, known as Shanghai plaster. What it is 3 layers of plaster. The first one is a very crude one applied over, say, brick. And then the second layer would start to shape the intended form. And then, of course, they will be sprinkled over with very fine pebbles, stones, or even dust, so that the external surface can be granite dust and so on. Actually, it appears to be very sturdy and very strong. And this is usually used in this is a top view of the tombstone. You can see this is the backing piece of the tomb has fallen back, and you can see that the plaster is keeping all the bricks in shape, even as it has toppled over. As mentioned before, greenstone would have come from Trenzo. It comes in different shades. If you are well-to-do, you can afford this. But more commonly, you find granite, right? And those might have been quarried in Bukit Timah. We believe that a lot of it is also quarried from elsewhere. There is also mention of granite, a kind of a grayish granite with blackish specks, which is perhaps because of the color and how it looks. This would have been imported from Malacca, and commonly it's in the cemetery and among filmmakers it's known as Malacca stone. And of course, you have marble. Here you already see adaptations of the tombs. You have encaustic tiles, which are these on the ground, the clay tiles. And then, of course, you also have ceramic tiles and mosaic tiles. So you have different kinds of tiles. And what I'd like to mention here is that, recently we had a discussion about what really is a Peranakan tiles, and there is no real answer. When you have tiles, it doesn't mean that it is a Peranakan tiles, but at BUKIT BROWN, we do know that there are a lot of Peranakans buried there, and if we cross-check their tombs with the designs, very often we find that they would like to use these decorative tiles as they would have used them in their homes on these surfaces themselves. So this is a Hokkien Peranakan. and this is a Teochew time. So in both cases, these decorative tiles were used as a substitute, and most of the time, floral motifs are chosen to sort of have a bane to the deceased when they are not there in person. They're used in different places: tomb shoulders, the altars, the terraces, and the paths, and so on. So once again, this is a kind of a very interesting legacy of what building materials are used. Some tombs, very few, I think, spot this technique of cut and paste ceramic art. And also lead lettering. So if you can imagine, there once was a trade in Singapore where you would hammer, you would have you have these taken out from the marble, chipped out of the marble, and then holes drilled before you hammer very soft lead into to form the words. The English ones would have been quite difficult, but imagine these are sort of in Chinese text. And then more contemporary materials like terrazzo, we've already mentioned mosaic. So what, and this was decorative tiles. These really demonstrate to us that apart from a very standard form, what we're also seeing is that even for two materials, they are changing with time. So remember, the cemetery operated from 1922 to 1973. So that really sort of demonstrates to us the kind of range of materials used from 1922 to 1973. Time, space, and ritual. Most of the time, the cemetery would be visited during Qingming, and which is generally understood as one of the 24 segments of a calendrical reading, right? And I think normally most people call it lunar calendar, but it's actually probably more accurate to call it an agricultural calendar, because it works in relation to agricultural cycles in China. I think one might ask, what is the relevance of understanding these kinds of calendars outside of China, where the weather system is slightly different? But I suppose in Singapore, as overseas Chinese or overseas Indians or overseas, everyone has multiple calendars that they carry with them. And I suppose this is one of the calendars that would still be relevant. Because all these other festivals, like dumpling festivals, mid-autumn festivals, the observances are still related back to that kind of agricultural cycle. I was very surprised because during this research, I found that actually spring rolls, as the name suggests, once upon a time only was eaten in spring. No other time, but it's become very popular. Probably any foods like that. So here is a reading of time that I think perhaps Singaporeans can reacquaint with, because without this, there's also no way to understand a lot more of the overseas Chinese custom in a deeper way. Then of course, space and time. Most of the tombs were not measured by inches and centimeters, although it appears on this tape. What you see here also are two lines, right? There's two lines of Chinese text. The top line, which is the Wengongce or Mengongce, they've been used for building structures for the living. And you would use those indicated in red as dimensions. Don't ask me why. This is just what is told to me. And then if you want to build structures like tombs and all that, you would use the Ding Lance for building structures. So there's a kind of again practices, right, that builders and carpenters have used in the past. And then of course as mentioned, every year during the Spring Cleaning Festival, the families would come and there would be rituals. Such as repairing the tomb with colored paper. This is kind of a symbolic repairing of the tomb. That's one of the versions anyway. And then of course there will be offerings and then burning of drugs. Of course, such burning probably in the light of environmental concerns, maybe they should be changed. But here are the customs. There's a lot of burning. These are the colored paper. Of course, this is symbolic sort of money that's burnt together with that. But alongside that, you have different kinds of food offerings too. So on the left are offerings during the Lunar New Year, where families will also go to the cemeteries. And then on the right-hand side is the Spring Cleaning Festival itself. In terms of foods, the Hokkiens usually, sometimes they would distribute grains along with nails and coins. It's just custom. And then on the right-hand side, you have Teochews who would consume blood cockles on site, and then of course they will spill the shells all in. So these are what I'm saying. These are really customs that are maintained by some of the families. And if the cemeteries are no longer in Singapore, this will also go. So some how are you doing? So some preliminary conclusions. Firstly, the cemetery is really quite important. Sorry about that. Firstly, it's the cemetery is really important because if you have been following sort of the history of cemeteries, the Bukit Brown Cemetery is the final one where there is no segregation in relation to ethnicity. So what I mean by that is that you will have Big Santing, it is a Cantonese cemetery. You have Hong Ho Sua, it's a Teochew cemetery. But sometime along the early 20th century, what happened was that there was a change in the banking system. Right? There was a requirement for sort of Chinese of Singapore to come to them. So banks before that kind of turn of events would also be segregated along ethnic lines. Right? So you have Wong Yik Bank for the Cantonese and so on and so forth. But you notice that banks after this period, right, the United Overseas Bank or the OCBC, these now suddenly regarded the overseas Chinese as a particular group. And perhaps Bukit Brown would then also be a kind of a space where that sub-ethnicity differentiations would not matter anymore. That's the first point. And related to that, of course, is that Singapore became a rather wealthy port city, and the cemetery really marks the congregation of people moving, notably from Malacca, notably from Semarang, different parts of Southeast Asia, to the port city, and then of course subsequently new places were found. So in Sarawak, for example, a lot of towns like Cebu had a lot of connections to Singapore. Secondly, as I mentioned already, there's a Peranakan material culture. Right? How would you classify the Peranakan? Would you say that they're Chinese or they're sort of a slightly more mestizo group? And then, of course, there are local histories. And then, in terms of material culture, it's really quite important for us because if you remember, shortly after the 1970s, Singapore began to rely on labor, non-foreign labor, right? So it began with Malaysians, Thai workers in the 1970s, and then subsequently it moved to sort of Bangladeshi labor, Myanmar, and also mainland China. So it's really an encapsulation of the kind of skills and building materials that existed in Singapore and after. And then, of course, you can see there's a kind of a correlation of the tombs didn't remain the same. Right? They kept on changing, and this is also in relation to how people saw. So here is an indication of how good the material is. So from this fragment of brick, you can shape this lantern. So here you have the front areas of the tombs, right? So adapted to use for the descendant. So a tomb really, in its larger context, is really for the descendant, not for the dead. And then thirdly, of course, this whole aspects of translations of what home is and what materials are used. onto the sampling space. It's actually also it's an interesting sort of correlation for us. So what needs to be done? I think Singapore is really lagging. I already mentioned that there's no real recognition of the languages that are used in the tombs, the level of use of Mandarin. But if we look at around us in Taiwan and in Southeast Asia, there are transformations of this old cultures to more contemporary uses. So here is an example of electro-techno neon gods in Taiwan, which has become very popular. They dance to techno music. And then of course in Johor, there is an invention of a new tradition called the 24 festive drums, which is again really related back to that calendar system that I was telling you about. And it's become so wide. I mean, it now has a regional kind of followers. So much so that I think there's some schools in Singapore that have already started this tradition as well. So this, of course, again, with the understanding of time, links them back to tradition. So I think today is really a significant day because it's 5 years ago Georgetown and Malacca received the World Heritage status, and I think with this need to sort of understand and sort of claim what constitutes heritage in Singapore, perhaps we really need to think a lot more in relation to what we have in Singapore, and also in relation to a place like BUKIT BROWN. Okay. Thank you very much.
BUKIT BROWN. Yeah. Okay. These 50 years in when the BUKIT BROWN Municipal's Primary Cemetery operated took us through a period of a lot of changes in Singapore as well. Yeah, you see, in the 20s, Singapore, in the 20s saw the beginning of Singapore's first economic takeoff. Then we were there. Then we went into the period of depression with the rest of the world. And then Singapore went into the period of war and came out of it. And then into a period of state of emergency and then came out of it. And then into a period of struggling for independence and self-determination, and then we came out of it. And finally, by the time Singapore gained independence and had started to build its own economy, the century closed in 1973. So yeah, it is a time when the Chinese community existed very much in between being a migrant and settler and being a transient resident here. I was hoping to always, when I look at the tombs there, to determine whether they saw themselves as a Singaporean or just a resident. What do you see about, or from all the things that you see we've found so far?
Just want to use the couplet to explain. I think there are, of course, connections to China. Those remain. But let me just. Okay, if you look on the right, oops. Yeah. Why is there a need to bury my bones in my hometown, wherever my coffin is covered is my home? So this is a prominent OCBC banker, Tan Yin Kiam's couplet, so very prominently displayed. So this, I think there are conflicting attitudes. I'm sure that there are some, like Tan Yin Kiam, would have considered that this is the new place for them to reside. And also notably, there was an event that changed perceptions in China as well. In 1949, China became a communist republic. Suddenly, the affiliations have also changed. Right? So there are people who are long-time supporters of the Republican movement, found it difficult to reconnect with the kind of China, and so on and so forth. There was no actual trade between Singapore and China, and then of course, then they had to really look around the neighbors to establish these new identities. So it was also a period where I think the regional identities and also probably these kinds of local identities were also becoming quite strong. It was only subsequently, I think, that it changed.
On the point of local identifying with the locality, I see that every grave has got a little earth deity, local deity monument. Does that mean, therefore, that every grave, in a sense, asserts its link to the local soil, local sites?
Good question. I think it's commonly found in tombs in Southeast Asia. There are studies about similar kinds of structures elsewhere, the dapokongs and all that, which have some kind of claims. I think Dr. Hui would be the best person to tell you about that. But I think in the case of Bukit Brown Cemetery, like other cemeteries, it is often seen that it's probably this earth deity that is symbolically residing there and guarding the grave. Beyond that, I don't know what kind of local connections. I mean, it is on the site. It is not something that is reconnected back to China or something like that. So if that's the case, although we say that we don't have any dapokongs, most of the time it's really just the earth god or the earth goddesses.
In the case of Bukit Brown, because many of those buried there were from Kien descent, and so they put the home tower, the name of the home tower, right on top of the place too.
Yeah.
So apart from that, the rest is very simple.
Yeah, I think they would. I think some of the tombs don't even have their sort of birthplace and sort of their lineage from China anymore. I think a lot of them have, but there are also tombs that don't have. Perhaps these are the people who can no longer sort of very easily identify which exactly is their hometown in China.
Besides the Hokkiens and the Teochews, are there any other dialect groups that are found on Bukit Brown?
Yes, there are Hainanese, Puchao, Hakka, Cantonese. There are most of them are found there. What I have been showing you today is really the sort of the main types. There are two main types of Hokkien and Teochew, and even for Hakkas and some Cantonese. Just now I showed this tomb, which is Ho Sek Kong, which is Cantonese. So this is this one is. This is yeah. This is Ho Sek Kong, which is Cantonese, and there are variations, but for today's talk, I only talk about this two.
Just give me a sense. If you can give me a sense of the chronology between the styles that you mentioned. The consolidation of the different styles, and then you have the hybridization, and then you also mentioned the abstraction, and then perhaps after that, if you can, then I can make a social comment that relates to your observation.
Yeah, make now lah. Well, I think that's the next step I really need to do is to really look at the chronology. But you would think that that what I drew out as a if you think it's wrong, please let me know. But most of the tombs that we see have that characteristic, and then so we try and base it on that characteristic, and then of course then try to spread it across the examples that we have. Also to note that most of the examples are drawn from the 4,000 tombs that are trapped. Of course, there are some that we find interesting and we bring into the discussion, but we really need to look at the as you suggested, the chronology with style and then see what, even to trade records, right? What kinds of materials are exported from Quanzhou and so on and so forth. We've not been able to do that yet. We hope to do that, but let us know your social comment.
I just wanted to say, from just plainly observing and just looking at some of them, I tried to go into Bukit Brown. Because I got followed so many people on Facebook. But anyway, what I noticed is that with the hybridization, You often see that more from the later 1920s and then continuing into the 30s. The styles of Art Deco, and then more strongly pronounced the abstraction of the styles of the graves is probably from the 1940s to the 1950s. Personally, when my great-grandfather passed away, he actually wanted a very modern grave, and then he actually told his son, who was my grandfather, that to construct it in the abstract style rather than the Art Deco, which he said was already quite dated by the end of the war. So the one thing I noticed is what struck me is how modern the graves are, the evolved modernity. Because when you show the Riley and Hargreaves catalogue, they're actually transposed from the Grammar of Ornament, from Owen. He wrote that book, The Grammar of Ornament, and how up to date it was in the Edwardian time. So what you can see from the so-called what we call Peranakan, but actually the late Victorian and what was fashionable in the First World War, we see in Bukit Brown Singapore's design of the graves as part of a worldwide phenomenon. So again, in the 1920s and 30s, where you had the Art Deco and you had the simplification of the motifs and the abstraction of the motifs, you see that in other aspects of design, in architecture as well, and in urban planning. So that just struck me, how modern the trends that you see in Bukit Brown parallel what's happening in the living world.
Thanks, Andrew. I had a very abbreviated sort of comment there, but it's exactly what you said. Right? There's a lot of cotton flows of materials, and it didn't take long for these design ideas to be shared in Singapore. But certainly, it will be good to have everybody work together to see really that progress, and which is also the reason why immediately moved away from sort of the type and then to the discussion of the different types of material. Because I think it would be an injustice only to show it as a kind of innate type and form, but show that actually it changes all the time.
One of the things I noticed in this set of slides is, I don't know if you noticed the paintings, right? The paintings that look a little like oil paintings on some of the tombs. Did these tombs brought about more craftsmen in Singapore, and there's kind of a renaissance to artisan?
No, I think those would probably be printed tiles. Printed tiles, and also in the sort of flows of that mountain that is depicted could have been Fuji and things like that. But they are printed tiles, and they are also in use in many parts of in home. Right? So it wasn't just in the cemetery.
Okay, we have a question from here.
For me, I'm very keen in the tiles because I think they're not only Peranakan, it's actually more than that. When I went to Northern Thailand, I saw a lot of this border of Vietnam and Northern Thailand and Laos. There were a lot of very interesting tiles which is actually very similar to what I saw in Bukit Brown. So that's where I saw the interest in that, the lions and the angry birds, all those things. Which is like, I think it's a living word. It's not really dead. Because it's like, for example, my house, when I did my Tokyo house, it's like something like Peranakan house, but it's actually not. It's because it's like, it's mass produced. But it was at the time in the 80s, everybody had a kind of house. So my house is a kind, see. And then in the 90s, it's a different kind, and now different kind of designs.
Yeah, thanks for your comment. I really didn't call them Peranakan tiles. So those. Yeah, but your point is valid that there's a lot of flows. You find those kind of tiles in India, you find those tiles not just in Singapore, but also in quite a lot of places where people could afford or have available those building materials. So which is why I think the material culture, if you look at it closely, it does tell us, as Andrew has already suggested, this whole aspect of how Singapore worked as a port city and also how rich it was.
But your point about there being no drawings or typologies, I was wondering if you're referring to perhaps history departments lacking these kind of records. But how about institutional knowledge in the temples or the tomb builders and so on? I mean, they have the sort of drawings and typologies that you were referring to. And you also mentioned that for Malacca there were some inaccuracies in the records. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Malacca wasn't about the inaccuracies about records. It was the similar task of trying to draw a tomb and say, okay, this part is called this part is called this. And subsequently that we found out that they were also using reference to this the Taiwanese text that we were using. And not only that, the labels were wrong. Some of the labels were wrong. So we realized that actually it's not. It was useful to have a scope, but in terms of trying to name each of the parts of the tomb and draw it out, it was difficult. There were no known drawings of tombs, so some of my students started to measure them and to draw them out. The institutional knowledge would have been in the craftsmen themselves, the tomb makers themselves. They would they have all the figures in their heads. If you ask them, they will tell you, okay, there are certain principles, like for example, the principle of not having a line cut across the middle of the tomb. Right? So you never would have a line dividing if there's a line there, you have to put a brick half across that axis. So these kinds of principles are something that the tomb makers use, and of course they would also be inflected by requests. Right? Sometimes they will have new designs, sometimes they will have use of different materials. So their craft is also changing with what they know and what they have inherited from the parents or other craftsmen. So what I mean by institutional knowledge is I don't think ours is also institutional knowledge. We're just trying to record them and to make sense of what they are.
So some of this knowledge, there was a cluster of tomb makers that were very active at the Long Ha Wall and cannot really know you can see of course the entire village now there. So that has been lost as well. So we can't trace back to say the clans or that kind of knowledge information.
Yeah, there were two as Simpson described, I didn't really talk about them today, but there were two villages at BUKIT BROWN, and they would be the carvers and so forth. And their workmanship is really very, very fine. I mean, if you look at the Shanghai plaster, for example, it has to be made on site. Right? It's in situ construction. So the evidence of the skill is in the tomb itself, and it cannot be pre-made and brought to site. And especially if you look at the Teochew graves and how fine the plaster looks. So my argument is that really that what we are looking at is a craft of a very high level. Of course, it's to respect the deceased, but it's also probably made by local or Malaysian craftsmen.
Good afternoon, Dr. Lai. Thank you very much for inviting us on the tombs, designs, material cultures. I have two questions. First is that just a little bit larger context. Have you made any comparative analysis of the tomb culture designs between those in Singapore and that in Malaysia? And if so, what are the significant similarities and difference in the tomb design or cultures? Second question is also concerning about whether the so-called this site BUKIT BROWN, does it meet the criteria for us to make an application to the UNESCO as a kind of a historical or cultural site? If not, what are the areas, what are the shortages, or what are the areas that we have to work on? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for one easy question and one difficult question. The easy question is that I had been working with material from colleagues like NQ about Malaysian tombs. I think those are really recorded. I think it's a shame that they have a lot more people working on tomb types and all that. those books that I referred to already have documented quite a number of things. By way of comparison, I think it's more important, first of all, for us to do more records and get our drawings and all that accurate, and then start to work across and compare with Malaysians. And I'm sure there are a lot of similarities. People have already pointed out to similarities in tomb design. But there are also differences, which is why I think when I started out, I referred a lot to the Malaysian documents. Then subsequently I felt that, maybe there are also differences between Malaysia and Singapore. So I started to also talk to the tomb makers and the craftsmen. I think definitely in time to come we would like to look at what the similarities are and also the differences, but we're still looking. Even these craftsmen, they are now working across between Singapore and Malaysia. The market is still Singapore and Singapore. The present batch of craftsmen, they're working across. The second question is a very difficult one. I think by this exhibition you can already see that there is a lot of value. And my other research actually talks about Singapore as a very important center for the overseas Chinese. If you look at statistics alone, if you want to talk about overseas Chinese, there's 80% of the overseas Chinese live in Southeast Asia. So if you then isolate Southeast Asia, most of the Southeast Asian enclaves of Chinese living in Southeast Asia regard Singapore as a very important node of Nanyang Chinese. So this is probably the reason why they have no trouble having Singapore as the site for the university, which is supposed to represent overseas Chinese and so on and so forth. Mahua Wenxue, they're all focused here. So there is a very strong case to start to say, okay, how do we commemorate Singapore as a very important overseas Chinese center? And my guess would be that BUKIT BROWN, together with all these other ethnographic records, would be a very important source to suggest that.
Okay, thank you. For those of you who are interested in the Malaysian tombs and cemetery, we have with us today Mr. Lian Q, who's a researcher who's been very active in Malaysia in this type of research. And he's published a book that is written in Chinese, and that's available. He's brought some copies here. If you check our reception, we will be able to get copies of it. Okay. With that, we will thank Chee Kien for sharing with us a lot of the BUKIT BROWN.